friend.
Here's a short,
I hope you have a
punchy
great day
hook
at
for your
work.
story. I came for my friend, but every time she looked at me, it was like I didn't belong anywhere else. Then she said, I should stop you, but you make that hard. If you want, I can also craft 5 alternative hooks that are equally intense and clickable for YouTube. The moment I stepped into my friend's house that evening, I expected nothing more than a casual hangout. The familiar hum of conversation, the faint smell of dinner in the kitchen, and the soft glow of warm lamps were all comforting, almost ordinary. I thought I knew what the night would hold. Laughter, old stories, maybe a couple of drinks, but something in the air felt different. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably charged, like the kind of energy you feel just before a storm. And then I saw her. It wasn't at first deliberate, more like a flicker at the corner of my eye, a movement, a presence that didn't belong to the ordinary rhythm of the evening. My friend's mom walked through the room with a kind of quiet authority, effortless yet magnetic. She wasn't loud or flamboyant, but her very presence seemed to bend the light, the air, even the mood of the room around her. Her steps were measured but fluid, her hands occasionally brushing objects or people with an ease that felt intentional without being performative. When our eyes met for the first time, it wasn't shocking, more like recognition, as though I had glimpsed a fragment of something I didn't know I had been searching for. Her expression carried a soft, teasing awareness, a slight tilt of her head that hinted she knew the effect she had without ever trying. And then she moved on, leaving me uncomfortably aware of the warmth that lingered, not in the air, but somewhere deeper inside me. I reminded myself why I was there, to see my friend, to catch up, to be a guest in someone else's home. Yet every instinct in me wanted to watch her, to notice the small details, the subtle sway of her hair as it fell over her shoulders, the quiet way she laughed at jokes I couldn't fully hear, the soft scent of perfume that followed her like a shadow. Each movement, each glance, was disarming in its intimacy, though nothing about it was overtly romantic or even flirtatious. It was simply compelling. When she passed near me in the hallway, our hands brushed, accidental, or perhaps not, and a warmth spread through me that made my chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. I caught myself studying her without intending to, fascinated by the ease and confidence she carried, the subtle kindness in her gestures. Every glance she gave, every soft smile, felt like an unspoken acknowledgement of something neither of us had named. The room filled with laughter, clinking dishes, and conversation, yet I found myself noticing only her. My mind oscillated between guilt and fascination, a constant internal tug-of-war. I knew what I was feeling was complicated, possibly wrong, yet undeniable. There was a quiet gravity to her presence, an effortless pull that made it impossible to be indifferent. By the end of the night, I understood something crucial. This wasn't just casual admiration or passing curiosity. Something small but significant had sparked between us, a subtle awareness that would not easily fade. It was the kind of connection that hovered quietly beneath the surface, a slow burn that promised it would grow, unbidden, undeniable, and dangerously compelling. And I realized, with equal parts fear and anticipation, that the night was only the beginning. The evening settled into its familiar rhythm, soft laughter echoing through the living room, clinking dishes from the kitchen, and the faint strains of music that seemed to hum from the corners of the house. I tried to focus on my friend, to immerse myself in shared stories and jokes from the past, but every time my eyes wandered, they found her. She moved through the space with a fluid grace that made everything else seem dim in comparison. Yet it wasn't just her beauty that captivated me. It was the quiet confidence she radiated, the ease with which she seemed fully herself in every moment. I found myself drawn toward the kitchen, ostensibly to offer help with snacks, but the real reason was far simpler. I wanted to be near her. When I reached for a bowl at the same time she did, our hands brushed, light, fleeting, yet electric. The warmth lingered, as if her touch had left a quiet imprint, a reminder of the silent pull between us. She looked at me then, not with overt flirtation, but with something more subtle, A teasing acknowledgement, a soft curve of her lips, a tilt of her head that made the air around us feel charged. "You're helping, or just making things more complicated?" she asked, her voice smooth and warm. The words themselves were casual, almost playful, yet the undertone made my chest tighten. I stammered a reply, suddenly aware of how conscious I had become of her presence, how every small gesture, every glance, carried weight. There was an intimacy to her movements, an ease that invited attention. She passed plates, arranged snacks, laughed softly at jokes I didn't entirely catch, and yet each motion seemed designed to draw me in, if only slightly. Every accidental brush of hands, every brief glance that lingered just a moment too long, was an unspoken conversation, a delicate dance neither of us had named but both of us understood. Later, in the living room, we reached for the same magazine at the same time. Our fingers met again, this time lingering slightly longer. I felt a jolt run through me, subtle but undeniable, as if the air between us had thickened with quiet electricity. She didn't pull away. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile that seemed to recognize the tension simmering between us, without needing to voice it. I caught myself observing her with a focus that made everything else fade. The soft fall of her hair over her shoulder, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the gentle curve of her hands. There was a confidence in her that wasn't arrogant or showy, but quietly commanding, making the world shrink to the space around her, and by extension, to me. By the time I returned to the couch, my mind was spinning. I had come for my friend, yet all awareness of him had faded. I was fully conscious of her, of the subtle current pulling us closer. The accidental touches, the shared glances, the quiet laughter, they weren't just fleeting moments. They were the first bricks laid in a foundation that neither of us could ignore, a slow burn building beneath the surface, simmering, intimate, and utterly consuming. And in that moment, I realized that what had begun as a spark was becoming something more, something deliberate, something mutual, something I couldn't easily name but couldn't stop noticing. The evening was no longer just a casual visit. It was the beginning of a connection that would change everything quietly, insistently, and irresistibly. As the evening deepened, the house seemed to shrink around us, every sound, every flicker of light, drawing me closer to her without a single word. I found myself following her movements almost instinctively, pretending to help with chores or fetch something from the kitchen, but really just wanting to exist in her orbit. The subtle rhythm of her presence, the soft cadence of her laughter, the way she leaned slightly when speaking, the warmth in her eyes, was hypnotic. At one point, we were in the kitchen together, arranging dishes on the counter. Our hands brushed again, longer this time, and the warmth of her touch lingered far longer than it should have. I felt my pulse quicken, awareness sharpening to every detail. The curve of her fingers, the way the lamplight caught her hair, the softness in her smile. I tried to convince myself it was accidental, just the natural closeness of being in the same space, but the pull between us was undeniable. "You're dangerously helpful," she said softly, a faint smile playing at her lips. The words were casual, but the tone carried something else, a subtle acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of the tension simmering beneath the surface. I opened my mouth to respond, but my thoughts scattered. Her eyes held mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, warm and steady, almost daring me to admit the truth I hadn't yet voiced to myself. We moved into the living room, where a casual game of cards had drawn a few other people, but my attention was entirely on her. When she sat across from me, our knees brushed under the table. The contact was minimal, almost accidental, yet sent a jolt of awareness through me. She didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, eyes scanning mine with quiet amusement, as if she knew exactly the effect she had on me. Even ordinary gestures became charged. The way she handed me a glass of water, the subtle shift of her body when she laughed, the brief meeting of our hands as we reached for the same napkin. It all felt deliberate, though it could have been coincidental. My mind raced with questions, guilt, curiosity, and a strange exhilaration. How could someone be so ordinary and yet completely impossible to ignore? At one point, we found ourselves alone in a quiet corner. The house had settled, the laughter and clatter fading into distant hums. Her presence felt immediate, commanding yet gentle. We spoke casually about mundane things, groceries, recipes, a funny story about my friend, but beneath every word, there was an unspoken tension, a slow, steady current drawing us closer. Each glance, each brush of fingers, each pause in conversation was a conversation in itself, a language we were beginning to share without realizing it. And then the moment came. Her voice dropped slightly, warm and teasing, carrying a weight I hadn't anticipated. "You're here for him, but I can't help noticing you belong closer to me." It was soft, almost a whisper, yet it reverberated through me. My chest tightened, mind scrambling to process a mixture of guilt, excitement, and an undeniable thrill. It was the first verbal acknowledgement of what had been growing in silence, a recognition of the connection that had already been forming, slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. In that instant, everything changed. The evening was no longer just a visit. It had become a subtle confession, a moment suspended between propriety and desire, setting the stage for everything that would follow. The spark had ignited, and I knew, with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified me, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The night had quieted, the hum of the house settling into a gentle rhythm, and I found myself drifting toward the living room again. She was already there, perched on the edge of the couch, a book in her hand, though her attention was clearly elsewhere. The lamplight highlighted the gentle curves of her face, the soft fall of her hair over her shoulder, and the subtle way she held herself, relaxed yet entirely aware. My presence didn't seem to surprise her. Instead, there was a calm acceptance, a quiet invitation in the way her eyes met mine. I sat across from her, careful of the space between us, though I wanted to close it in an instant. The air between us was charged, not in a loud, dramatic way, but with a subtle, persistent electricity that made my pulse quicken. For the first time that night, there was no pretense. The casual laughter and surface-level conversation of the evening had given way to something quieter, more intimate, a private current running beneath the visible world of family and friends. We spoke lightly at first, about trivial things, the book she held, the soft lighting, the music in the background, but every word carried more weight than either of us intended. I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn by a gravity I didn't understand, aware of every gesture, every flicker of expression, every subtle shift in posture. Her presence filled the room in a way that made it impossible to focus on anything else. At one point, our knees brushed beneath the couch. The contact was minimal, yet I felt it as though it carried a deliberate intimacy. My chest tightened, my fingers tingled, and a quiet awareness of her nearness settled over me. She didn't flinch. Instead, her gaze lingered, calm and steady, as if she knew exactly the effect she had and was letting it play out with a measured patience. We began to talk more openly, cautiously, about personal experiences, childhood memories, and little regrets. Her voice carried a warmth that made every word feel significant, a rhythm that drew me deeper into the conversation. She shared lessons she had learned in her 20s, the vulnerabilities she didn't often reveal, and I listened, captivated not just by her words, but by the honesty and openness behind them. There were fleeting touches, almost accidental. A brush of fingers while passing a book, the subtle warmth of her hand near mine on the couch arm, the way our shoulders shifted slightly closer during a shared laugh. Each small movement carried an undercurrent of connection that was impossible to ignore, yet entirely innocent on the surface. And then she spoke, her tone playful but edged with a quiet certainty. "You came for him, but I can't deny the way you're here with me." Her words were simple, yet they hit with precision, cutting through any lingering doubt. My pulse quickened, my thoughts scattered, Yet there was a thrilling clarity in the acknowledgement of what had been growing between us. The evening transformed in that moment. The room felt smaller, more intimate, the world outside fading to a distant murmur. We existed in a bubble of quiet understanding, the slow burn of attraction shifting into something more deliberate, more mutual. The tension was no longer subtle. It was alive, measured, and beautifully restrained. By the end of that interaction, I knew with certainty that everything had changed. The connection we shared wasn't fleeting curiosity. It was a bond quietly formed, delicate yet undeniable, and would demand attention, patience, and courage from both of us. The slow burn was no longer just a spark. It was becoming a steady flame. The days that followed were charged with quiet anticipation. Every visit to my friend's house became a careful balancing act. Normal conversation, casual laughter, and yet a subtle awareness of her presence that I could never ignore. It wasn't just her beauty or charm. It was the way she made the ordinary seem extraordinary, the way every glance or gesture carried a weight I felt deep in my chest. I came to see my friend, yet I found myself constantly searching for her, drawn toward her as if by some invisible current. One evening, I arrived under the guise of helping my friend with a trivial task, but I knew, just as surely as I stepped through the front door, that I was waiting for her. And she appeared, barefoot on the carpet, hair loosely tied back, carrying a steaming mug of tea. There was a casualness to her movements, but beneath it lay the same quiet confidence that made every space she entered feel warmer, alive, intimate. Her eyes found mine immediately, and there was a moment, a pregnant pause, where everything else seemed to fade. We settled across from each other on the couch, the silence between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that demanded attention, that spoke volumes without words. When she handed me the tea, our fingers brushed, brief but electric. My pulse spiked, awareness sharpened, and the simple act of holding the cup became a shared ritual, a silent acknowledgement of the tension between us. "You think too much," she teased softly, her voice melodic, teasing, yet careful. Her words weren't a reprimand. They were recognition, reading me better than anyone else had that night. I smiled, caught between embarrassment and fascination, realizing how acutely she understood the effect she had. Our conversation shifted seamlessly between light humor and deeper reflections. She shared moments from her past, fleeting regrets, and small triumphs, each sentence carrying her presence into my awareness more firmly. I listened, captivated not just by what she said, but by the cadence, the subtle inflections, the way her eyes lingered on mine when she spoke. Every detail, the tilt of her head, the curve of her lips, the quiet gestures of her hands, felt deliberate, intimate, though nothing explicit passed between us. At one point, our hands met again, naturally without ceremony. A subtle brush became a lingering contact as our fingers intertwined, tentative at first, then with increasing certainty. There was no rush, no overt statement, just the quiet acknowledgement of what had been building since that first glance. The intimacy was breathtaking, a blend of warmth, curiosity, and restrained desire that neither of us could, or wanted to, ignore. Time seemed to stretch. Each shared glance, each small touch, each lingering pause created a rhythm, a silent conversation layered with meaning. It was intoxicating. The slow burn had evolved into a mutual awareness, a delicate connection that neither of us had fully named but both recognized. By the end of the evening, I understood something profound. The line between propriety and desire had been acknowledged, tentatively tested, yet neither of us rushed past it. The attraction was alive, palpable, and thrilling, a dangerous but irresistible dance that promised more. The slow burn had become a steady flame, patient, deliberate, and quietly consuming, leaving me both terrified and exhilarated at what the next encounter might bring. The following evenings were marked by a strange rhythm, an almost magnetic pull that made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. Every casual visit to my friend's house carried the weight of anticipation. The air seemed charged the moment I crossed the threshold, as if her presence alone reshaped the space. I told myself to focus on my friend, to remain just a guest, but my attention always found her, moving through the room, arranging dishes, laughing softly, or simply existing with effortless grace. One evening, the house was quiet, most of the guests having left, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the clock. I wandered into the living room, and there she was, already settled on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, a book in hand, though she wasn't reading. Her gaze met mine instantly, warm, inviting, with a subtle, teasing quality that made my chest tighten. There was no need for words. The air between us carried an unspoken understanding. We started talking casually about trivial things, but gradually the conversation deepened. She spoke of small regrets, lessons learned, and moments of vulnerability she rarely revealed. Every word was colored by her warmth, her quiet confidence, and an honesty that made my pulse quicken. I was captivated, not just by what she said, but by how she said it, by the rhythm of her voice, the subtle play of her expressions, the soft intensity of her gaze. As we talked, our proximity became more pronounced. Our knees brushed, minimal yet electrifying. I felt the warmth of her hand near mine, subtle touches lingering longer than expected, the faintest intimacies that spoke louder than words ever could. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed the tension to exist, a delicate dance of restraint and acknowledgement. The slow burn that had been simmering for weeks was no longer hidden. It was alive, deliberate, and mutual. Then, she leaned slightly closer, tilting her head, her voice dropping to a soft, teasing whisper. "I should stop you, but you make that hard." Her words carried weight, a quiet authority paired with playfulness, a recognition of the connection that had been building. My chest tightened, a mix of exhilaration and fear flooding through me. It wasn't just attraction, it was an acknowledgement of everything unspoken, everything simmering beneath the surface, now finally given voice. For a long moment, we simply sat there, eyes locked, hands brushing, suspended in the quiet electricity of the room. The tension wasn't reckless or overt. It was deliberate, measured, and profoundly intimate. I realized then that this was no longer about fleeting curiosity or accidental attraction. It was something deeper, mutual, and irresistible. Every glance, every subtle gesture, every shared breath seemed amplified. The world outside faded, leaving only the quiet intimacy of that small living room, where boundaries were tested and desires cautiously acknowledged. I understood with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified me. This connection was real, undeniable, and inevitable. By the end of the night, as I reluctantly left, her hand lingered just a fraction longer in mine, a silent goodbye filled with promise. I stepped out into the cool night air, heart racing, mind spinning, acutely aware that the slow burn had evolved into a steady flame. And I knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever feel the same again. The following week carried a quiet intensity, as though the house itself anticipated our inevitable encounters. Every visit felt different, more deliberate, more charged. Yet neither of us rushed the unfolding rhythm. I arrived under the pretense of hanging out with my friend, but I knew, just as surely as I stepped through the door, that my focus would inevitably find her. And there she was, in the living room, bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, perched comfortably on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her, book in hand though her gaze was clearly elsewhere. Our eyes met immediately, and in that fleeting connection, an entire conversation passed silently. There was no need for words. The unspoken understanding that had been simmering between us was now fully present, palpable, and undeniable. I took a seat across from her, careful to respect the subtle boundaries, yet acutely aware of every inch that separated us. The tension in the room was electric, quiet but insistent, a slow burn now fully realized. We spoke casually at first, but the conversation naturally deepened. She shared small stories from her life, moments of vulnerability, and lessons learned that she rarely voiced aloud. Each word carried a quiet weight, her voice calm, yet magnetic, drawing me in with a gravity I couldn't resist. I listened, mesmerized, noticing every detail, the tilt of her head, the curve of her lips when she smiled, the subtle shift of her body toward mine. Every small gesture felt intentional, intimate, though nothing overt was said. At one point, our hands brushed again. This time, there was no hesitation. Fingers intertwined naturally, tentative at first, then with increasing certainty. The warmth of her skin was grounding, reassuring, a quiet affirmation of the connection that had grown between us. Her touch spoke louder than words, carrying promises of patience, understanding, and mutual desire that neither of us had yet dared to voice aloud. The room seemed to shrink around us, the world outside fading to a distant murmur. Our shoulders brushed, our laughter shared quietly, our eyes locking with an intensity that made each moment feel suspended in time. There was no rush, no dramatic confession, just the slow, steady acknowledgement of what had been building all along. The intimacy was profound, rooted in awareness and attention, a connection far more compelling than any overt gesture could convey. Finally, she spoke, softly, almost reverently, her voice layered with warmth and playfulness. "I'm glad you stayed." Her eyes searched mine, gentle and unwavering. I smiled, feeling the weight of her words, realizing that this slow burn had grown into something steady, patient, and real. "Me too," I whispered, aware of the gravity in the simple reply. We leaned slightly closer, sharing quiet smiles, our hands still entwined. The room was alive with subtle energy, each movement, glance, and touch a testament to a connection that had grown deliberately, naturally, and irresistibly. It was YouTube-safe, tender, yet charged with intimacy. The slow burn had finally arrived at a steady flame. As I finally left that night, her hand lingered in mine for a heartbeat longer, and our eyes met with a depth of understanding neither of us could yet name aloud. I walked into the night with a heart full of anticipation, aware that this was only the beginning of something patient, profound, and quietly unstoppable.